I spent 100 days in Factorio Space Age, from mining rocks with nothing but a starter pickaxe to expanding my factory to the stars. This video will document how I survived 100 days in Factorio. Beginning on day 1, I crash land on planet Novus, collecting the scraps of my ship. I run around and mine some trees for wood and some rocks for stone and coal, followed by me placing down some burner drills and some furnaces to kickstart some iron plates. Using the iron I had collected, I craft more burner drills and then expand my setup over to the coal and copper. As day 2 dawned, I crafted the necessary items to create a small electric setup, which would work by turning water into steam and then using that steam to generate power. I would also set up a lab to start researching Military 1, which would give me access to a rifle so I could defend myself from the bugs on this planet. I would also run a line of power poles back to base and move the labs closer to my other operations, completing Military 1 in the process. I would also start researching Automation 1 to unlock assemblers, which I would use to start automating some makeshift red science. On the morning of day 3, I finished the basic red science setup and placed 2 labs to double my research speed. I also decided to go for electric miner drills for my next research, so I don't have to rely on my burner drills anymore. With my new 2 labs setup and red science coming in slowly, I end the day by completing electric mining drill research, and also complete logistics 1, which gave me access to splitters and underground belts. On the morning of day 4, I plan out where I want my furnaces to go, and start placing down some electric miners on the coal, and some on the iron. I also decided to explore the west of my base, as my pollution was starting to reach outside the area that I have revealed on the map. I also created another furnace stack adjacent to the iron in preparation for copper smelting. On day 5, I began working on setting up a basic mall for all the necessities I'll be needing, and split off some coal from the furnaces to feed the boilers, as I was tired of manually refueling them. Day 6 began with me setting up more essentials on the mall, like splitters, belts, undergrounds, and all the inserter types I had access to. I also finished steel research and tripled my electricity output, before working on expanding my furnaces and miners. I also decided to extend the mall to include pipes, assemblers, miners, and underground pipes. On day 7, I added turrets to the mall and made another furnace stack. I also spent some time planning out where I wanted my bus to go, as I wanted to keep things organized. Morning of day 8, I expanded my coal miners and placed a radar south of my base. I also continued to add more furnaces to my existing furnace stacks into the night. On day 9, I began work on setting up green circuits and a basic bus to organize my production lines. I also leached off the excess iron to make yellow ammo to deal with any bitiness that may be nearby. I also start work on setting up automated red science and place another radar east of my base, and I end the day killing some worms and my pollution. On day 10, I expand the copper and power, and then work on designing an efficient setup to create green science. On day 11, I managed to fully automate red and green science and scale up their production. I also create some science labs and finished physical damage 1 research. I also finished military 2 research and military science pack research. On day 12, I work on making an extra furnace stack for iron and then another for steel. I also add steel to my bus and begin working on automating military science. On day 13, I complete engine research and add stone and stone bricks to the bus so that I can make walls for my base, and also use them for military science packs. On day 14, I begin the day working on automating military science packs. However, I noticed that some biters are taking up some pollution, so I go and decide to slaughter their nests. I also place a radar north of my base to reveal more of the map. On day 15, I make more miners and more electricity. I also get to research oil and finally end the day by automating military science packs and hooking it up to the labs. On day 16, I start work on adding more miners to the iron and then start work on automating engines. Since the crafting time for engines is super slow, I make sure to scale them up in advance. On day 17, I set up red belts, splitters, and tunnels onto the end of my mall. I also begin to handcraft some pump jacks and drive down to the nearby oil patch to tap some crude oil. I spent the night of day 17 into the morning of day 18 transporting oil back to my base through pipes. I also began planning out how I would set up my oil refineries so that I could transition over to advanced oil processing later on. On day 19, I complete plastic research and start working on cracking oil down into petroleum. And on the dawn of day 20, I begin setting up some chemical plants to make plastic. I also finished the research for red circuits. Since they need a lot of green circuits, I built another stack of those. Then I started automating red circuits and got it all done by the morning of day 21. On day 21, I set up rail production and expanded my science lab area as I was overproducing science. I also completed mining productivity research, which would give me a 10% productivity to all my miners. On day 22, I researched sulfur processing, blue science, and cleared a few nests, and set up sulfur production for blue science. I also started work on producing chemical science packs, which I worked on all the way into day 23, completing blue science. On day 23, I hooked up the blue science into the science labs, and then cleared out a few trees that were in the way of my evergreen factory. I also set up automated rail signal assemblers in advance before I completed the research. On day 24, I began researching advanced oil processing, and would finish the research fairly quickly, and then switched over my refineries from basic oil processing to advanced oil processing, giving me access to 2 new liquids, light oil and heavy oil. I also spend the night of day 24 creating sulfuric acid, which I will mainly be using for batteries. With sulfuric acid up and running on the morning of day 25, I start researching robotics and begin converting heavy oil into lubricant, as I'll be needing lubricant for electric engines and robots. I also start converting some light oil into solid fuel in preparation for rocket fuel, and end the day automating electric engines and completing robotics research. On day 26, I begin automating batteries and also set up flying robot frames to make robots. I'll also be needing roboports, so I create a single assembler to make them, as they take a ton of steel. On day 27, I noticed that my coal miners, which were directly going to the bus, were now empty, so I added some more miners to the coal patch, and then began research on personal roboports, as they would be necessary if I wanted to scale up production. Day 28 was pretty quick. I crafted some modular armor and then took out a few biter nests. I also crafted myself a personal roboport, batteries, and some solar panels to charge my robots. On day 29, I began thinking about making a simple train network to bring in more ore, as my starter patches were beginning to deplete, so I set down my first train blueprint and then crafted another personal roboport. I also realized in this moment that I placed one of my stone undergrounds incorrectly, so no rails were being made. On day 30, I automate medium and large power poles, and then begin working on the train unloader for my smelting array, finishing it by the night. On day 31, I began the day researching rocket fuel, and then continued to work on the train network for the rest of the day, reaching the iron ore patch. Day 32 and 33 were mostly the same, blueprinting out where I wanted the station to go, and waiting for my bots to build it out. On day 34, I made quick work of the nearby biters near the iron patch, and looking at my notes, apparently I said I felt bad for the biters. So silly. On day 35, I finished setting up the iron ore train, and it would go between loading iron ore from the ore patch and depositing it back at base to be unloaded and transported to the smelters. Day 36 was filled with me building another 2 extra furnace stacks for the excess iron ore I was importing, and hooking it up to a later part of the bus so the iron plates wouldn't be eaten up by circuit production. Day 37 was pretty usual. I built another iron furnace stack and then decided to start setting up a coal train as my coal demands were increasing. I also managed to complete rocket fuel research. On day 38, I started researching blue circuits and then got back to work setting up more coal. On day 39, I also set up a train refueling station, however I do not actually figure out how interrupts work because I'm silly. Also, the ratios for this abomination are definitely incorrect, but it's enough for me. On day 40, I complete blue circuit research and then expand my steam engine setup. I also begin researching low density structure, which I'll be needing to launch a rocket. On day 41, I spend the day setting up rocket fuel and made a buffer for the solid fuel so that my light oil doesn't clog the refinery setup. I also began work on making blue circuits, as I would be needing them to launch a rocket as well. Just like red circuits, they take a ton of green circuits, which makes them a terrible pain to acquire en masse. On day 42, I finished setting up the blue circuit production, and then decide to scout out the map in my car to see if there's any iron patches nearby. Steel is a bottleneck in my base, and I'd be needing a lot of it. On day 43, after an entire day of driving around the map, I finally find an iron patch. However, it's no use, since its placement is weirdly on a cliff and also next to biters, making it the most annoying thing to deal with ever, so I opt to find another one, which I find on day 44, which is a bit better, and I would be making use of this iron patch later on in the 100 days. I also finished low density structure. Day 45 and 46 was greeted with me automating low density structure, finishing the 3 main components I would be needing to launch a rocket. I also added more copper, steel, and iron to the bus. On day 47, I crafted more engines and expanded my old assembly lines. On day 48, I extended my bus and started preparing for concrete by adding another belt line to my bus for iron ore, as it's a component to concrete. Day 49 started with me queuing concrete research and finishing it before noon, leaving me one research away from the rocket silo. I also spent the rest of the day setting up everything necessary for concrete. On day 50, I decided to start automating electric furnaces, as I would be needing to transition over to a more efficient solution for my smelting arrays. On day 51, I decided to double my entire steam engine setup, and I also complete logistics robot research. On the start of day 52, I decided to move one of my train roundabouts to align better for future expansion to the iron patch across the water. It wasn't necessary, but I don't think I could live properly if it wasn't aligned. I also decided to automate landfill so I could bridge across the water instead of routing through biters and cliffs. I also complete flamethrower research. On day 53, I set up flamethrower turret production, and once fluid wagon research was complete, I finally queued rocket silo research. On day 54, I get a bit desperate for iron and tried to see if I can set up 2 trains on the same patch. I think this was a good approach since the miners were kinda just idle once the chests were filled. I also rebalanced the miners so that both trains would get the same amount of ore. On day 55, I finished setting up the second iron train and hook up the new iron to my previous smelters, which I had depleted of iron ore and saved me from making another accursed furnace stack. On day 56, I spent all day placing roboports so I could remotely build stuff without having to be present. On day 57, I began work on making a wall for my base. However, the rocket silo research completes, and so I decided to change my efforts towards building a rocket silo first. With everything crafting for a rocket, I decided to set up space platform production so I can craft a starter pack, which is necessary to launch a ship into orbit. And with that, on the evening of day 58, the rocket is ready to be launched. Since I'm impatient, I also scale up my production for space platforms. On day 60, I notice my boilers aren't getting enough coal, so I hook up some extra coal from another coal line and then craft a space starter pack. I place it in the rocket inventory and then send off my first rocket into space. On day 61, I do nothing but send up another rocket. On days 62 to 64, I spend the days upgrading my mole chests to be able to be accessed by bots, and then worked on building the east and north of my wall. On day 65, I send another rocket up with some supplies, and then began working on building the space platform. I would also spend the rest of this day running over my base to refuel a train, as I still had no clue how to use train interrupts to automatically refuel the train. On day 66, I noticed a heinous copper shortage, so I started setting up a copper train, which would go down to a copper deposit near my other iron patch, and I would work on setting it up all the way through day 67. On day 68, I'm still working on the copper ore. On day 69, I finally finished the copper train and started sending some more supplies up to space. Once my supplies reached space, I started building out a platform with an asteroid collector, asteroid crusher, and the solar panel to power everything. On day 70, I realized asteroids are giving me some items that I would be needing furnaces to smelt, so I sent up another rocket and began to work on automating space science. On day 71, I finished setting up space science on my platform and started setting up my labs to be able to take in space science. On day 72, I placed down a cargo bay near my labs, which would be able to send down drop pods of science, which would then go into the science labs. I spent the rest of the day looking at the research available to me. On day 73, I decided to go with logistics system research, as I would like to make a bot mole. I also expanded my initial space science setup on the platform and then upgraded my armor. On days 74 and 75, I do nothing but build my wall. On day 76, I clear some nearby bugs and finish blueprinting out the north of my wall. However, I will need to wait before I have enough resources to complete it. On day 77 and 78, I start making the west of my wall by placing roboports and then having the robots handle the bulk load of making the wall. This saves me a lot of time, however I start to run low on roboports as well. On day 79, I make the grave mistake of sending 50 inserters up into a rocket by accident. I also finished bot logistic research around this time, so I start researching
ship thrusters
because they sound really cool.
Wow, I cannot say this damn word.
On day 80, I hook up more items to the logistics network, replacing their chests with active provider chests. On day 81, I start setting up a bot mole for some basic items. I also complete research and then have the choice of choosing one of the 3 planets to research. I decide to go with Fulgora as the planet description of lightning storms sounds really cool. On day 82, I add more recipes to the bot mole and spend the rest of the day taking out nearby databases since I don't have my defenses fully up yet. On day 83, I hook up some copper from the copper train as my copper demands were still not being met. On day 84, I start working on making a tank to clear out biters as they're getting stronger, and if my defenses are not up before my pollution spreads out further, I'll be in a lot of trouble. On day 85, I start work on making tank explosives at the bot mole and finish the day completing Fulgora planet research, sending up another space starter pack to create a new ship with the sole purpose of getting into Fulgora's orbit. On day 86, I noticed something odd. My trains aren't moving, and for some reason, I genuinely could not figure this out for the life of me. It would take me up until day 87 to fix this issue, so I completely waste day 86 roaming around the train tracks in disbelief. On day 87, I somehow fix the issue, and the trains start working again. I don't question it, and then end the day completing mining productivity to research. On day 88, I stopped building out a rail to the nearby iron patch I had scouted out earlier in the episode, and while building the track, I noticed that there's a great, wide, empty space where I could lay down my new electric smelters and build a new bus, so I mark it as a reminder on the map for later. On day 89, I spend the day making my way to the iron patch. However, when my rails get to the body of water in between my base and the iron patch, I realize I have not nearly enough landfill, which is concerning considering I had set up landfill production quite literally 5 real-life hours ago. But it's okay, as I decide to leech off the stone patch outside of my base with the sole purpose of creating more landfill. On day 90, the same train stopping issue occurred again. Okay, this just felt like Factorio was trying to rage bait me, but it's okay, since I was tearing down these stations sooner or later. I also spend the rest of the day tearing down old miners from starter patches so that I could recycle them and use them on the new iron ore patch outside my base. On day 91, since I have nothing to do but wait for landfill to accumulate, I decide to work on the wool all day. Apparently I can't have any fun, because on day 92, even my wools ran out, so I decide to just start working on a new electric furnace setup I had planned a few days prior. I also get my first biter attack of the 100 days, with it being so weak that my robots could outrepair the damage the biters were doing. On day 93, I spend the day setting up the first electric smelting stack for steel. On day 94, I send more supplies up to my Fulgora ship, and I don't even know what I did this day. I genuinely think I just ran around looking in my factory for bottlenecks. On day 95, I finish yellow science research and grab more landfill to go back and continue working on building the rails towards the iron patch. Honestly, my favorite part of this game is just building rails. It's so satisfying. On day 96, I finally get over to the iron patch, but with the bugs being so close, I decide to keep everything unpowered and start laying out the miners and the station. On day 97, I decide to set up a dedicated train to supplying and restocking outposts, as I know that I will be creating more of these in the future. On day 98, I start bringing light oil over to the outpost supply train stop, so that my supply train can carry oil from my base to outpost flamethrowers. On day 99, I finally get the outpost supply train ready, but for some reason it won't go to its destination. So I go to check if there's any missing tracks. I found out that I misplaced one track, literally right next to the train, but apparently that was just a minor rage bait, because that wasn't the issue either. On day 100, I take the train for a manual ride to find out that my dumbass placed the station the wrong way around. So I spend the day correcting the orientation of the station. And with that, we've completed 100 days. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching. Genuinely, this was so much fun. So if you would like to see 200 days of this series, please make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it.